There are people who feel genuinely fine with almost no one around them most days. Crowded streets, loud bars, overstimulating events quickly drain them rather than filling them up. Over time, they discover that having a tiny circle of familiar faces feels safer and calmer. Fewer plans mean fewer surprises, fewer disappointments, fewer conversations where they must explain themselves again. On paper, it even seems like a good deal, because peace is easier to manage than emotional turbulence. But there is a question that sooner or later appears, usually in a quiet moment. What does life actually have in store for someone who spends decades avoiding new people? What happens when you spend years walking the same streets, seeing the same friends, hearing the same stories? At the beginning, it feels like a healthy filter, because you are cutting noise and protecting your time. Slowly, almost invisibly, it can become a tunnel, where your only reference points are the same 3 or 4 people. And here arrives the first real risk of feeling complete without others beyond your current circle. When you live always close to the same tiny group, you start to blend into them. Not in a dramatic way, not in a movie-style transformation, but in small, stubborn habits of perception. Their way of joking becomes your way of joking. Their limits slowly become your normal baseline. You still tell yourself that you have free will, that you can distinguish clearly between right and wrong. Rationally, you know when something crosses a line, and you believe you would intervene. Imagine a night out with that one friend that you have always had, the one you know better than anyone. He drinks too much, gets louder, and starts behaving in a way that clearly makes a girl uncomfortable. You see his hands staying too close. You hear comments that would make you furious if someone said them to your sister. In theory, you know exactly what a decent person should do in that moment. Take him away. Stop the behavior. Give that girl at least one ally in the room. But there is another voice inside you, one that has been trained quietly by years of loyalty to a small circle. That voice says, "I know his story. I know what he has passed through. He is just exaggerating tonight." You remember how many times he helped you when you felt alone, and you owe him something, at least patience. So instead of stepping in, you stay still, maybe even laugh nervously, and watch the scene continue. In that moment, you are not the monster and not the hero. You are simply absent where your presence could matter. Years later, you replay that memory, and something inside finally starts to burn with clarity. You are not only ashamed of what he did, you are ashamed of not having felt shame in real time. You realize that spending years almost only with him had normalized parts of his behavior in your perception. By defending your comfort and your tiny circle, you had also defended a version of yourself that does not move. If while you listen to this you feel irritated, judged, or tempted to close the video, breathe. I am not here to call you a bad person or to put you under a moral microscope. I am talking to you because I have had my own moments of realizing I stayed silent when I should have spoken. I know what it means to look back and think, in that scene I was not the villain, but I was not exactly innocent either. When we struggle to step into the perspective of others, we also struggle to look clearly at our own choices. We become experts at understanding the context of our friends, their pain, their traumas, their excuses. Meanwhile, the girl in that story becomes just another extra in the background of the night. What you rarely see, unless someone forces you to really imagine it, is the emotional weight on the other side. The girl who has already counted a dozen unwanted touches or comments in the first hours of the evening. Her friend who has watched her cry again and again because she feels like an object, not a person. The stranger at the bar, more empathetic than you in that moment, who sees everything and quietly thinks, "Poor her." This is only one scenario, but it reveals something important about staying always in the same narrow circle. It shows how easy it is to confuse feeling complete alone with being safely neutral in every situation. In reality, there is no neutral position. Either you are supporting someone, or you are supporting the environment that hurts them. When you zoom out from that memory, you can finally see what it reveals. There are at least 3 serious risks in living inside such a tiny, closed social universe. The first risk is simple. You merge so deeply with your few people that their blind spots disappear from your radar. You become loyal to the group at the expense of your own capacity for empathy. Every time you stay silent, you rehearse the same role again, the quiet spectator who lets convenience win over conscience. The night ends, everyone goes home, and on the surface, nothing huge seems to have happened. This is where the question behind the title becomes sharper and a little less comfortable. Feeling complete without others can protect you from noise and unnecessary drama. If it also keeps you forever inside the same narrow tunnel, it starts training you to see only what your little circle sees. And that is the first step toward living like someone chained in a cave, mistaking a few shadows for the rest of reality. The story of that night in the bar is not just about one friend behaving badly. It is also about what you were able to see in that moment and what remained invisible to you. To understand why living in a tiny, familiar circle can limit your perception so deeply, it helps to borrow an old image from philosophy and drag it without hesitation into everyday life. In the allegory of the cave, Plato asks us to imagine a group of people chained inside an underground cave from birth. They cannot turn their heads. They can only look straight ahead at a wall. Behind them, there is a fire, and between the fire and their backs, other people walk past, carrying objects that cast moving shadows on the wall. For the prisoners, those shadows are the only reality they have ever known, because they know nothing about the fire, the people behind them, or the world outside. If you grow up like that, you do not say, "This is a shadow." You simply say, "This is how things are." Now imagine that one of the prisoners is freed and forced to stand up and turn around. At first, the fire hurts his eyes. The shapes behind him are confusing. The movement feels too much to handle. His entire nervous system resists because the old shadows were painful, but they were predictable. Then, slowly, he is dragged outside the cave into a light he never imagined. The full light of the sun is unbearable at the beginning. Everything is too bright and detailed and raw. With time, however, his eyes adapt, and the painful brightness gradually becomes information. He starts to see trees, faces, colors, streets, a sky that had never existed inside his mental world before. At some point, he understands that what he saw on the wall were just poor, flat projections of a much larger reality. When he returns to the cave and tries to explain this to the others, they do not celebrate him. They think he has gone mad. His eyes look strange. His words do not match their experience. Some versions of the story even suggest that they would rather kill him than let him pull them out of their safe darkness. Now, what does this have to do with you feeling complete without others and staying always inside the same small circle of people and places? When you live years with the same 2 or 3 friends and the same routines, with the same conversations on repeat, you are not technically chained. But your emotional reference points become just as narrow as the wall of the cave. The way your tiny group reacts to women, to strangers, to conflict, to success, to failure, slowly becomes your default definition of normal. You might tell yourself that you could think differently if you wanted, and that is partly true. Yet the reality is that our nervous system learns above all by repetition and imitation. If you rarely expose yourself to new kinds of people, new ways of speaking, new boundaries, your internal world stays lit only by the fire behind your usual wall. In that bar scene, the drunk friend making the girl uncomfortable is one moving shadow. Your silence is another shadow on that wall, shaping what feels acceptable to you. The jokes, the excuses, the stories you and your circle use the next day to minimize what happened are more shadows on the same surface. The girl's fear, her disgust, the anger of her friend, the quiet discomfort of the stranger who thinks, "Poor her." Those are happening outside the frame of your usual reality. They exist, but they do not register with full force because your emotional eyes are still not trained for that light. The allegory of the cave is not really about smart versus stupid people, or enlightened souls versus ignorant masses. It is mainly about how hard it is to leave a familiar, limited picture of the world, even when the wider picture would be more accurate and more human. If you feel complete without others, your cave is not empty and depressing. It is well furnished, organized, efficient, and comfortable enough that you rarely question it. You have your hobbies, your routines, your favorite shows, maybe your work or your creative projects. That map keeps you stable, but it also keeps you in one place. The second risk of never leaving that map is that your ability to feel with others stays underdeveloped, like a muscle that has only ever lifted the same small weight. You might not be cruel, you might not wish harm to anyone, but you simply do not notice many of the moments in which your presence could change something. You do not ask questions that open people up. You do not stay a little longer when someone is clearly struggling. You do not say, "I saw what happened. Are you okay?" You tell yourself that you are drama-free, when in reality, you are just emotionally underexposed. Your empathy network never gets the training it needs to grow, because it is always looking at the same few shadows on the same familiar wall. The third risk is more subtle and appears quietly over time, almost unnoticed. By staying always with the same few people and avoiding new connections, you also avoid new mirrors. You do not meet people who would confront you gently with your blind spots, or environments where your current version of yourself would no longer be enough. When the only mirrors you have are your old friends, you continue a version of yourself that they recognize, not necessarily the version that would make you proud in 10 years. So when we ask what life has in store for someone who always avoids new people and stays in the same restricted circle, the answer is not a curse or a prophecy. It is more like a quiet trajectory that slowly points your life in one direction. Less chaos, fewer surprises, fewer chances to be deeply hurt. Yes, that part is true. But also fewer chances to see where your current cave ends and where a wider, richer, more demanding version of reality could begin. At a certain point, staying distant stops being a decision and becomes a reflex. You don't wake up thinking, "I will avoid people today." It simply feels unnecessary. Your nervous system has learned that minimal social exposure keeps everything stable and predictable. Less interaction means fewer misunderstandings, fewer emotional negotiations, fewer internal adjustments. Over time, this efficiency starts to look like maturity, even wisdom, especially compared to chaos around you. You see people burning out in relationships, chasing validation, collapsing when others disappear. You look at that and think, "I am clearly doing something right." And in many ways, you are. You have trained yourself to self-regulate without external anchors. You don't panic when plans cancel, when messages stop, when routines change slightly. That is a real psychological skill, not a coping illusion. The problem begins when that skill quietly replaces curiosity. When you stop asking who others really are, because your inner world already feels sufficient. You still show up socially, but mostly as a controlled version of yourself. You listen, you respond politely, you keep things light and manageable. What you avoid is emotional friction, the kind that slightly destabilizes your internal order. Not because you fear people, but because you don't feel you need them. This is where emotional withdrawal becomes deceptive. It doesn't feel like isolation, it feels like optimization. You reduce exposure, reduce intensity, reduce unpredictability. Your life becomes smoother, calmer, quieter. But smooth systems rarely evolve on their own. They repeat what already works until something external forces change. This is why people who feel complete alone often don't notice stagnation happening. Nothing hurts enough to trigger alarm. Nothing feels wrong enough to demand attention. The absence of pain becomes proof that everything is fine. Yet emotional growth rarely announces itself through comfort. It usually arrives disguised as mild discomfort, awkwardness, or relational tension. If you constantly avoid those states, you also avoid the information they carry. This is not about becoming extroverted or emotionally exposed to everyone. It's about recognizing that emotional distance, when overused, dulls perception. You stop noticing subtle signals in others because your system doesn't require them. You don't read emotional rooms deeply because nothing inside depends on it. Over years, this reduces your ability to intervene meaningfully when situations demand presence. Not because you don't care, but because you've trained yourself not to enter. Your default response becomes neutrality. Neutrality feels harmless, but it is not always neutral in its effects. There are moments when neutrality quietly sides with whatever is already happening. This is where people later say, "I didn't mean harm, I just didn't step in." The skill of emotional withdrawal kept you stable, but it also kept you passive. And passivity, repeated enough times, becomes part of who you are. Here is the part most people get wrong when they start questioning their emotional distance. They assume the only alternative is becoming needy, dependent, or emotionally chaotic. That fear alone keeps them frozen in the same safe position. But emotional openness is not an on-off switch. It is a controllable dial. You don't need to abandon your stability to regain sensitivity toward others. You need to create small, deliberate points of emotional engagement. Think of it like training a muscle you intentionally underused, not repairing something broken. The first step is learning to intervene without overcommitting. Intervention doesn't mean rescuing people or becoming responsible for their emotions. It means allowing yourself to be slightly present when presence actually matters. Saying one sentence when silence would have been easier. Staying 10 minutes longer in a conversation you would usually exit early. Acknowledging discomfort in the room instead of ignoring it completely. These actions do not destabilize your internal system, they gently expand it. The second step is separating empathy from obligation. You can feel with someone without taking ownership of their outcome. Many emotionally distant people avoid empathy because they confuse it with responsibility. Empathy simply means accurate emotional perception, nothing more. You notice, you understand, you respond appropriately, then you return to yourself. No emotional debt is created unless you choose it. This distinction is crucial for people who value autonomy deeply. The third step is choosing connections selectively, not universally. You don't need many people, but you do need some emotional friction. Growth happens at the edge of comfort, not in total exposure. 1 or 2 relationships where you allow yourself to be seen a little more clearly are enough. These relationships act like windows out of the cave, not a demolition of your structure. You remain grounded, but your perception widens. You start noticing when silence protects peace and when it protects avoidance. You become more precise rather than more emotional. The real gain here is not social approval or deeper bonds by default. The gain is moral clarity and emotional range. You are less likely to stay silent in moments that will later haunt you. You are more likely to recognize when your presence could prevent harm. You don't lose your independence, you refine it. You move from emotional self-containment to emotional self-direction. That difference matters more than it sounds. People who master this balance rarely regret opening up slightly. They regret the years when neutrality felt easier than involvement. Not because they were lonely, but because they missed chances to be fully human. Feeling complete without others can be a strength. Learning when to step beyond that completeness is what turns it into wisdom. The real question becomes what kind of life you are building on top of that stability. Emotional self-sufficiency is powerful early on because it protects you from chaos and dependency. Later, the same protection can quietly turn into insulation. Nothing hurts, but fewer things truly matter. Days pass smoothly, yet fewer moments interrupt you enough to stay with you. That's when people confuse restlessness with boredom. It isn't boredom. It's the signal that your system is optimized for safety, not for depth. This is where many people make a choice without realizing it. They either double down on distance convincing themselves that neutrality is wisdom, or they make a small adjustment that changes everything. That adjustment isn't becoming social, emotional, or exposed to everyone. It's learning when silence preserves peace and when it erodes self-respect. It's choosing a few moments where presence matters more than comfort. Not because you need others to feel whole, but because being whole doesn't mean being untouched. People who grow from this point don't lose their independence. They refine it. They stop using calm as a hiding place. They allow a handful of experiences and people to leave a mark, intentionally. Because a life where nothing ever reaches you is stable, but also closed. Feeling complete without others is a solid foundation. But foundations are meant to support something, not replace the entire structure. If nothing new is built on top of it, completeness turns into stagnation. The question isn't whether you can live without others, it's whether you want to. Cheers.